All right, so we're here today on this 2008 Hyundai Entourage, and you can't tell from this angle, but it's just dripping oil all over the motor from the valve cover gaskets. So we're going to replace those. So I'm looking forward to that because that's going to be a lot of fun. So in order to get those valve cover gaskets off, we got to unhook basically everything on the top of the motor and then remove it. So that's a huge pain in the butt. So first, just right off the bat, you got your 4 bolts and your little plastic piece that hides everything, and you got to remove those. And then once you have your plastic piece off, this is what's left. So with the plastic piece off and having this is what's left, I think I'm just going to start unbolting everything I can and disconnecting all the electrical plugs, and I'll probably start with removing that intake pipe and then go from there. I haven't read what the exact procedure is on this from Hyundai or anything like that, so I'm just going to look at it and do it and figure it out as I go. So if you think this is a good way to do it, then you can do it this way. If you think this is a bad way to do it whatever way you want. All right, let's go. So the first thing I did was remove the air box, which consists of disconnecting the MAF and then popping the little clip so the MAF wire comes off. And then you can pull your air box out of the way. It kind of like has a hinge connection there and 2 clips on the front. Then your intake tube is held on by a clamp here and has a hose that goes over to the crankcase breather. You'll want to disconnect all of those and remove that hose. All things considered, Hyundai made this pretty okay to service considering it's a V6 front-wheel drive configuration. There's a decent enough amount of room to work with to get to everything compared to a lot of other V6 things that I've dealt with. So we'll go through and we'll disconnect all of our plugs from this harness. That way we can fold this harness over. Now, this harness disconnects from everything that it needs to be able to swing out of the way. So they seem to have at least thought about this service, that it would have to happen at some point in time, and made it possible to do, which is kind of decent of them. So these clips, let's see, all of this will have to come off, so that's really annoying. I haven't found a good way to get these off yet, although I'm sure there might not be one. So yeah, take all your wire harness, fold it out of the way, and then we'll get to the next steps. Now that you have your wiring harness out of the way, I'm going to take this bracket loose from the intake manifold. Take your coil packs out. You'll have 3 of those. You'll take the connecting tube for the valve cover breather, and then there's a little gutter on front that's held on by 2 bolts that has a wiring harness running through it. You'll want to remove that little gutter, and once all that is off, you should be able to loosen the bolts for the forward valve cover and pull that off. So before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and take the intake manifold off to get access to do both valve cover gaskets at the same time. So I could just do this one, bolt this back together, and then do the back one after that. But I think I want to do the back one first and do this last for whatever quirky reason. So I'm removing all these bolts, and I haven't figured out exactly what all is attached to the upper section of the plenum yet. So I'm going to do that kind of as I go. And once I figure it out, I'll get back to you and tell you what all needs to be removed in order to get this bad boy off. Now the plenum should be loose at this point because I've taken the bolts, and then once it's loose I can kind of pull on it and see what's attached to it, and that'll be a pretty good indicator of what I need to remove. So let's go ahead and do that and see what keeps it from coming off, shall we? Oh. Well, that doesn't move very well at all, so there's definitely some stuff on the back side of the engine that I haven't disconnected yet. So, with that said, we have a greater pain in the rear than I thought to begin with. Alright, now I have the upper section of the intake manifold off, and in order to get that off, you know, I had to pull the harness back around. And there were a few plugs on the back side of the engine that were pretty hard to get to. And then for the intake manifold itself, I had to take the throttle body off because there are two hoses on the bottom of the throttle body. And it was just easier to take the 3 bolts off the throttle body and pull it away from the intake than to try to disconnect those 2 hoses. Now, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts on the intake manifold that have to come off for that to be removed. So I removed those. And then on the back side of the engine, there is a 14mm bolt on this steel bracket that's bolted to the back side of the intake manifold, and a 12mm bolt on this side of the intake manifold. Now, in order to get this 12mm bolt off, there's the intake breather hose that goes to another port on the back of the intake. So you do have to take that hose off to move it out of the way to get to that bolt. And then also another hose that runs over to your brake booster from the intake. So lots of potential vacuum leaks here. So I'll be really happy if I put this thing back together and it doesn't have any vacuum leaks. That would be a really nice, absolute miracle. So I can see here that this hose looks like it's starting to split or something. That's not great on the back side there. So there's looks like I'll be making a trip to the parts store. Next up, I'm going to remove my coil packs and my fuel injector clips from this side so that I can get all the wiring out of the way and then get the back intake manifold cover, or sorry, valve cover off and replace that gasket because it is just dumping oil out of the back side of the engine. So shop vac, remove all of the bugs and dirt as best I can so nothing falls down in the engine, and then pulling the valve covers off. So that's taking all these bolts loose and doing that. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Let's get started. They put enough dang bolts in this valve cover. Like, this is ridiculous, man. How many bolts it takes to get this dang thing off. It's just like, oh man. All right. Hey, there we go. Look at that. We got a valve cover with lots of oil seeping everywhere, and it doesn't look like the oil's been changed as much as it probably should have, but everything looks all right in the motor. Cool. So I've already got the forward valve cover on, and now I'm going to put the back valve cover on. You get your gasket surfaces all cleaned up as well as you can, and then you put your gasket in this groove here, and then you got to kind of finagle it in there and be careful not to let the gasket drop down because you need it to go where it's supposed to go. And it's got this groove to be fitted in here to go, or sorry, to stay where it's supposed to go. So I'll just gently swing it around, guide it in, and just keep an eye on this bad boy and make sure it doesn't fall off when I'm putting it in here. And then it's got some guidance pegs, and then you can kind of feel and just make sure your gaskets around your spark plug holes and everything where it's supposed to be. And that went in there pretty easy, and it looks good. The next thing is to put all your valve cover bolts back on and torque them. I'm torquing all these. I think the Hyundai spec from a quick Google search was 84 inch-pounds. Don't quote me on that. Look up your torque spec yourself, because I just Googled and went with something that sounded pretty good, and I believe it's correct, but there's the possibility that it could be wrong. I think that comes to about 8 foot-pounds or something like that. And that seems like a pretty good number, and I did that and I felt pretty good about it, so that's what I'm going with, just out of having done this a few times and doing it by hand and then comparing the torque spec. This is somebody else's van, so I'm not going to do it by hand, but I've always done it by hand and never had one of mine leak for a few years, so got good service life out of doing it that way. But the 8 foot-pounds of torque seemed to work all right, so that's what we're going with. So torque all the valve cover bolts, and then putting it back together will be the reverse of taking it apart. So I'll let you know if I have any stumbling blocks or things to look out for when putting it back together. Well, that actually went back together a lot easier than I expected. I didn't hit too many hiccups on anything. I'd reckon to say if you can take it apart, then you should be able to put it back together just fine. Now the fun part, let's see if it starts.